The Soviet Union built a supersonic airliner that looked almost exactly like the Anglo-French Concorde and flew it into the sky 2 months before Concorde ever left the ground. They won the greatest race in aviation history. They won it by stealing it. Spies inside the French factory, blueprints in a briefcase, microfilm smuggled out by priests. One of the largest industrial espionage operations ever run. And then, in front of 250,000 people, their stolen masterpiece tore itself apart in the sky and fell onto a French village. The Tu-144 carried paying passengers for barely a year before it was pulled from service forever. In the West, they mocked it with a nickname, Konkordski. But the real question isn't why it failed. It's how it failed so completely when they had the winning design in their hands. There's a rumor about that, whispered for 50 years, involving what the French may have done once they realized they were being robbed. We'll get to it. The Soviets stole the blueprints for the future, and it still ended in a fireball. In the early 1960s, Britain and France announced they were building something no one had ever built. An airliner that would carry ordinary passengers faster than the speed of sound. Concorde was more than a plane. It was a statement that the West owned the future. Moscow could not let that stand. The space race had been the Soviet Union's proudest triumph. First satellite, first man in orbit, and supersonic passenger flight was the next great symbol of technological superiority. The Kremlin issued the order: build one and fly it first. There was only one problem. Soviet civil aviation was decades behind. Its airliners were rugged, simple machines built for frozen airstrips, not razor-thin delta wings cruising at twice the speed of sound. The engineering required didn't exist in the Soviet Union, and there was no time to invent it. The Kremlin didn't ask its engineers whether it was possible. It told them the date and left them to find the technology somewhere else. And there was only one place in the world where that technology already existed: a factory in the south of France. What followed became one of the biggest industrial espionage operations in history. The KGB's man in Paris was Sergei Pavlov, officially the head of Aeroflot's French office, the airline's ordinary, respectable representative. In reality, Pavlov was building a network. He worked through political sympathizers to recruit paid informants inside the Aerospatiale plant in Toulouse, where Concorde was being built, quietly buying blueprints from men on the factory floor. For years, it worked beautifully. Thousands of documents flowed east. According to a declassified CIA account, the ring even used 2 Czechoslovakian priests to smuggle rolled-up microfilm of Concorde plans out of the country. Then, in 1965, French counterintelligence stopped Pavlov and found Concorde's landing gear and braking system drawings inside his briefcase. He was expelled from the country. But here's the part that mattered. He wasn't the only one. A second, higher-placed source kept feeding Concorde's secrets to Moscow for another 2 years before he too was caught. The Soviets didn't copy Concorde from photographs. They bought it, page by page, from the men who were building it. And the theft delivered exactly what Moscow had demanded. On the 31st of December, 1968, the last day of the year, because the deadline said so, the Tu-144 lifted off for its first flight. Concorde wouldn't fly for another 2 months. The Soviet Union had won. The propaganda victory was total. Photographs of the 2 aircraft side by side showed machines so similar that Western journalists immediately coined the mocking nickname Konkordski. And on paper, the Soviet jet was arguably the more impressive one, bigger and faster than its Western rival. In 1970, it became the first passenger aircraft in history to exceed twice the speed of sound. But look closer, and the differences start appearing. The Tu-144's wing lacked a subtle shaping that Concorde's had. And just behind the cockpit, the Soviets bolted on something Concorde never needed at all. Two small, retractable wings, nicknamed the Mustache, which swung out to give the jet extra lift when flying slowly. When your copy needs extra parts the original didn't require, you haven't copied the design. You've copied the outline and rebuilt the inside yourself. Those differences weren't cosmetic. They were symptoms. Here's what the stolen blueprints could never hand over: the engines, and the deep aerodynamic refinement underneath the shape. Concorde could cruise at supersonic speed using its engines alone, with afterburners lit only briefly for takeoff and acceleration. The Tu-144 couldn't. To hold supersonic flight, it had to keep its afterburners burning, a technique that drinks fuel at a catastrophic rate. That single flaw crippled everything. Range collapsed. Operating costs soared. A passenger jet designed to cross the Soviet Union struggled to fly usefully far at all. And inside the cabin, the experience was brutal. The aircraft was reportedly so deafeningly loud in flight that passengers sitting next to each other could not hold a conversation. Some accounts describe travelers passing written notes to communicate. They had stolen the body of the future and bolted it onto the engineering of the past, and no amount of espionage could hide the difference. For a few years, the Soviets managed to keep those problems out of public view. Then they took the Tu-144 to Paris. June 1973. The Paris Air Show at Le Bourget, the largest aviation event on Earth, and this year, a direct showdown. Concorde and the Tu-144 in front of roughly 250,000 spectators. Concorde flew first, and flew flawlessly. Then the Soviet jet took its turn, with test pilot Mikhail Kozlov at the controls, a man who had reportedly boasted he would outperform the Western aircraft. The crowd watched the Tu-144 pull into a steep climb. It leveled off violently. Then it pitched into an abrupt dive, and as the pilot fought to recover, the aircraft could not take the strain. The left wing tore away, and the jet broke apart in midair. Burning wreckage fell onto the village of Goussainville below. All 6 crew aboard were killed. So were 8 people on the ground, including 3 children. Homes were destroyed. The Soviet Union's answer to Concorde disintegrated in front of the world's cameras at the world's biggest air show on the West's own soil. And the cause of that crash has been argued over ever since, because of a story that surfaced years later. The rumor goes like this. The French knew they were being robbed long before they arrested Pavlov, and rather than simply shut the leak, they used it, quietly feeding the Soviet network doctored blueprints and false technical data, letting Moscow build its jet around deliberate errors. A former Soviet intelligence operative has claimed that incorrect information about Concorde was indeed passed to Moscow. It's an irresistible story. It's also, honestly, unproven. No declassified Western archive corroborates it, and aviation historians frequently dismiss it as legend. The crash itself has never been definitively explained. Theories range from a violent evasive maneuver to structural overload during an aggressive display. The most famous explanation for the Tu-144's failure may be a myth, and the boring truth is worse. It failed because copying a shape was never the same as building an aircraft. The program never recovered. Passenger service lasted barely a year. After another crash during testing in 1978, the fleet was grounded for good, having flown only 55 scheduled passenger flights. The world's first supersonic airliner spent its final years hauling mail. And yet, this story has one last turn that nobody could have scripted. In the 1990s, with the Cold War over, one surviving Tu-144 was pulled out of storage, rebuilt at enormous cost, and put back into the sky as a flying laboratory for NASA, gathering data for a future American supersonic airliner. The aircraft, built from stolen Western blueprints, ended its life flying research missions for the United States. Here's the lesson underneath all of it. Espionage can give you the answer, but it can't give you the understanding. The Soviets obtained Concorde's drawings and won the race by 2 months, and lost everything that mattered, because the parts that made Concorde work weren't on any blueprint. They were in the engines, in the aerodynamics, in decades of accumulated knowledge that no spy could photograph. You can steal what a machine looks like. You cannot steal knowing why it works. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.